So much for the nice introduction. And I'm excited to be here. And I remember research days. So you guys, it's a lot of work and a lot of fun though. And I'm excited to see like you guys as undergrad ones, like the first posters potentially. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to talk to you today, and I want this to be pretty informal. I think, Kay already mentioned that. So if you do have a question, just push the button. Because it is being filmed, he's asked me to remind people to do that. But please interrupt me. I don't, I'm okay with that. But I thought I'd talk to you kind of about like how I moved from working in the lab and what my thought process was into kind of what I'm doing now, which is a bit more of a desk jockey, but still really integrated into the science. And so my journey began, and I forgot I have a little clicker, at WSU. Obviously, so I will say, I'll step back. As an undergrad, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I initially had always thought I was going to become a pilot. Clearly not a pilot, right? And I stepped back and I was like, okay, what was I good at? And I was good at chemistry in high school, and so I decided to major in chemistry, and largely because I had a friend who passed away from cancer in high school. And I wanted to devote myself to actually developing cancer drugs. And so that started my journey, really. And then I wanted to go into the pharmaceutical sciences, so I did my Ph.D. in pharmacology, toxicology, where, as mentioned, I worked for Margaret Black, focusing on engineering suicide genes for cancer therapy. And it's during this time, and I know for the Ph.D. students, when you're doing your qualifying exams, that I gained a lot of experience in what I'm currently doing, whether that was the scientific writing, literature searching, clearly critical thinking. I think you all need to do critical thinking. Presenting, we had to do these days. We also had to present typically once a semester, not only to our committee, but also to the entire PhD group. Additionally, I helped with, teaching assistants. But I will mention, and I think because our qualifying exam was quite different. I think this is cutting out. Is it okay? And when I was at school, what we had to do is we were actually given, over the course of about 8 weeks, these our committee members would each choose 2 journal articles for us. And what they would do is they would lock us into a room with no internet, with just a printer and a computer, and 3 references. There was one time I got 0 references. And they would remove the results and the discussion of the paper. So you'd have the introduction, the methods, as well as the figures and tables. And if there were any concluding remarks within either the introduction or the figures and tables, those would actually be struck out. And what we had to do was actually sit down, interpret the data, and then write the discussion based off of that. And so we had to go through this 4 times at least. We had to pass 4 out of 8. And so, it was such a painful experience. And every time that, like the night before, I'd get unbelievably nervous, and yeah, I needed like Xanax. But I passed all 4 immediately. But I look back at that, and I really looked like that this was actually kind of an interesting way for us to, expand our critical thinking, but also to think about how we were writing, because we were judged on writing. And so you had to improve essentially your writing skills as well as your analysis as you moved forward over those 8 weeks. I had a great experience at WSU, which I also, I took all the opportunity I could to help with writing of manuscripts. I would also review manuscripts. So when Margaret would get ones where, she was asking to be a reviewer, she would actually hand them over to me, and I would do that. And then I'd give her my thoughts, and then she would obviously expand on those. So I really took the time to do that. And looking back, it wasn't intentional. It was just something that I kind of gravitated toward. So then I went to Mayo Clinic, where I did a postdoc in the molecular medicine department in Richard Vile's lab. And there I was working on oncolytic viruses. And so we were engineering them to be even better oncolytic viruses, as well as utilizing them for, the idea was I would actually use like T cells to attach the virus to, and then it would traffic to the tumor site and then release the virus so that you had even more specific targeting. And so there, I continued to refine those core skills that I gained at WSU. Obviously, I gained a lot more experience in research in oncology, as well as doing a bit more of a translational research. We did have a virus that went into patients. Furthermore, I also, similarly with Margaret, Richard would help or provide me with kind of all of the articles that he wanted me to review, because he was an editor on a journal, and so I became kind of one of the reviewers, and then give them back to him. And so I was doing a lot of writing, not intentionally. Also, I had my own funding, so I was doing my own grant writing. And so I gained, again, a lot more writing experience. However, so why I left the bench. So, I was very immersed in the lab. And I always knew I didn't want to be a professor. So even when I was a grad student, like I knew I wanted to go into industry. However, I always thought I just wanted to be in the lab, that was going to be my life. However, while I was at Mayo Clinic, and I'm sure all of you have had some of this experience, is I dealt with mice constantly. Like I felt like I was going to go to mouse hell, to be quite honest, where they were going to be injecting tumor cells into me and giving me virus and watching me, and doing terminal heart bleeds. And I couldn't handle it anymore. My poor, like, soft bleeding heart was like, I can't do this. I can't, deal with animals anymore. Additionally, I looked at kind of some of the funding opportunities, and, really right now, and these articles are actually a few years old, so they could have very well changed. But the average age of a first RO1 is 42, and so realistically, I had a lot more time to go. I still haven't reached 42, and only approximately 15% of postdocs will get tenure track positions, and so they don't hand them out to everybody. Additionally, I think people are money motivated. People will make more in industry, more likely, versus obviously a postdoc where I was making NIH minimum, which to me felt like $1 million after graduate school. So, but I still knew I wanted to move on and not become a super doc. And so I started looking into alternative science careers. And so I did a lot of reading as to what was out there and kind of trying to identify what were the skill sets that I was good at. And I talked to people a little bit. Actually, during one of the research days, we had somebody come who discussed kind of regulatory affairs within a pharmaceutical company. And so I chatted with that person, got an idea of what that looked like, what was the day-to-day. I did do some regulatory affairs coursework on the side. Mayo Clinic was nice in the sense that the postdocs could take any class they wanted to. For free, and so I took advantage of those opportunities as well while I was there. And I ultimately kind of ran across medical writing, and I thought, I really enjoyed the writing that I've been doing in the lab, and I'm pretty good at it. And so I did some interviews with agencies across the United States. I wasn't held down by anything, so I was ready to move to wherever. And I landed a job in New Jersey for a company called Articulate Science. They're a large kind of privately owned agency that has about 8 or 9 companies that sit under the umbrella of Nucleus Group. And the reason why they have this is largely because of firewall. So they're getting clients from different pharmaceutical companies, and so they need to make sure that there's no conflict of interest between who's working on that. So I worked there for about 4.5 years. I did publication writing for 2 oncology products. One of them is nilotinib or Tasigna, as well as ruxolitinib or Jakafi. One with Tasigna being for CML, Jakafi for myelofibrosis, and it's even expanded into like polycythemia vera. And then I transitioned actually from kind of that pure publication writing and to the commercial and medical marketing for another oncology product. I remained on the Tasigna and Jakafi accounts, but also then added a lung drug. So as a writer, there's actually a lot of different opportunities for you. So mine were publication and promotional in nature, but there's also medical education, medical journalism, which is actually really kind of an exciting thing, and you can do that on the side. You can make it your own career, but it was something that I also looked at. There's kind of this regulatory protocol writing, so a lot of biotech companies or pharmaceutical companies, as they're writing their clinical study reports, these are long reports that are necessary for health authorities, for the FDA, et cetera. And so I'm going to focus today on what I did within my role, which is the publication and promotional. So my life as a medical writer on the publication side, what did I do? It was more than just pure publications of, writing journal articles and review articles. I did a ton of abstracts for different, scientific conferences. We did case reports. We also did gap analyses, so we'd survey the literature and try to identify what are the real areas of unmet need in different disease states, et cetera. I did a lot of key opinion leader videos. So this was working with investigators who are running these clinical studies and getting them to talk about their experiences with the product, mechanism of disease and action graphics, some digital training for medical science liaisons who are the field force for pharmaceutical companies. And so I'll talk a little bit more about them actually later. Additionally, I spent a lot of time with the actual what we call key opinion leaders, or KOLs. These are largely academic people or in the clinic who are running these studies. And so, they're the experts in the field. So I did advisory boards where we'd sit down and talk to them for 4 hours to 2 days about their opinions on where we should be taking these products and the drugs. Competitive intelligence, looking at what other companies were doing. Also fun medical and marketing meetings that are kind of similar to today, where people get together and talk about what's going on and such. And so this is just kind of a few examples of the things that I actually did when I was on this. So I wrote a New England Journal of Medicine article. Obviously my name's not on there, but I was the writer for that, and I feel like not a lot of people can say that they've been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But I did a bunch of journal articles across the board, as well as here's just a few examples of some of the posters that we did. So then, about 2 years in, I transitioned over to what we consider the promotional side. It again was a lot of writing, but it was different in nature, right? So this is actually kind of that forward-facing, what you would see if you go to Tasigna.com, what materials physicians are being given from, when a sales representative is walking into their office and talking to them what, the pharmacist sees. And so I did a lot of written pieces, as well as multimedia, which are kind of similar to what I talked about. And similarly, the meetings, even though they were a little bit different in nature in terms of what we were talking about, they were pretty similar. And so this is some examples of some of the projects that I did on the promotional side. So we came up with a campaign for Tasigna.com that was on their website for Novartis for several years. Which I can point to it down here, is kind of like what we'd consider our product monograph. I did a MOA video, clearly working closely with people who know how to illustrate. I do not. I can do really nice stick figures. And so the great thing about this job was, so Novartis is based out of Basel, and so I regularly got to go to Europe because we were constantly interacting with physicians across the globe. And so I was traveling probably once to twice every month to Europe from New Jersey. And so, it takes a lot of time, but it was just such an amazing experience because I got to see so much of the world that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And so there is that aspect. So I don't know. These are kind of just a snapshot of what you do, and there's so much more that I can't go into today. So I wanted to break it down to kind of give you an idea of what the typical players at an agency would look like. And so generally, and this is very simplified, there's generally some sort of business director who's really in charge of ensuring that, everything from the agency is running well. They're kind of that upper management. Additionally, there's a group, which is new business, who helps identify new business opportunities. So one of the things that I did when I worked for Articulate Science is I would literally go to pharmaceutical companies. They would do a request for proposals because they had work similar to the work that I showed you coming up, And so we would have to go demonstrate our knowledge in that area, show them what we were going to be doing, and then they would either choose us or not choose us. And those were called pitches. It's kind of similar to what you would see on Shark Tank, but maybe a little bit more elaborate. And so new business is kind of that area. There's client services, so they're the ones that are truly interacting with the client and getting like, what's the scope of work going to be? What are the things that we need to do? Making sure they're happy. There's scientific and editorial, which is where I sat traditionally, and that was the content development and execution. And then within that, like, there are different levels, and so like I actually had a team of writers underneath me, so I would kind of be much more of the client-facing person who would actually go and talk to people, whereas I had people who kind of were in the background doing a lot of the work as well. And then our studio or graphics department, who are the ones that make everything gorgeous, and they're a lot of fun to work with. And so, there are opportunities not only probably for every single person in this room to fit within one of these categories. And so I would say like new business tended to be run by PhDs, MDs, PharmDs, because, they're the ones that need to really get out there and talk about the science in a very, I guess, good way. Scientific and editorial, so different agencies have different requirements. Our agency, we actually asked for higher degrees, so pretty much every single writer that was in our group had either a PharmD, MD, or PhD. And that is unique to that. But I think that the industry is moving toward that because there's a lot of expectations as to the quality of work that you're doing. And so that's kind of the typical players. And so I guess from a standpoint of like, would you be a good medical writer? If this is kind of something that you would be interested in. These are a few points that I would say is like, one, can you see the big picture? So you are going to be asked like, to really put everything into context as to why it matters. Why does it matter to a patient? I mean, that's ultimately kind of the end goal of how are you improving patient lives. Obviously, you need to be detail-oriented, which I would say probably the majority of the people in this room are, because if you're a scientist, you generally are. Aptitude for science and medicine, and again, I think most of the people in this room would qualify there. Quick learner and have a willingness to really kind of dive in. So kind of to give you an example, so those pitches that I did, we would generally have about a week to come up with, one, become an expert, quote unquote, in that area. And so like I had to learn about diseases that I knew nothing about, and I'd have to come up to speed really quickly and be able to go to these pitches and actually sound like I knew what I was talking about. And so additionally, you move from project to project fairly quickly. I was extremely fortunate that I stayed on essentially the 3 accounts that I was on for the entire course of my career there. A lot of people will bounce around from accounts depending on kind of what the business need is and what the clients are asking for. And so you do have to learn pretty quickly and dive in pretty deep. Critical thinking skills, do you have the ability to kind of zero in on the crux of the matter? You want to make sure that you're asking all the right questions so that you're getting the job done well. Writing ability, I would say you don't need to be Tolstoy. Nobody's expecting you to be the best writer out there. It's really like, can you actually distill down complex information into something that is easy for most people to understand? Excellent communication skills are obviously a bonus. Your ability to say what you need as well. So that goes back to asking those probing questions, because a lot of times you just can't make assumptions as to what the client wants. You need to, actually ask. And then, adaptability, et cetera, because as I mentioned, the agency life, things change rather quickly. And honestly, in the pharmaceutical world, things change really quickly as well. That's kind of a snapshot. And so thought about kind of providing what are some of the good and the bad of medical writing. So I think from the standpoint is you're at the forefront of science. Like I mentioned, New England Journal of Medicine paper, that's pretty freaking cool. At least in my mind it is. However, you don't get the credit for that data, right? That's somebody else's. Easy wins. So I will say one of the things that I found the most frustrating about being in the lab is, I'm sure everybody's had this experience. You do an experiment and it fails. and you do it again, and it fails, and you do it again, and oh my gosh, it succeeded. And then you're super excited, so you're like, I'm gonna do it again, and it fails. And I will say, my personality was, I got a little like kind of demotivated from that. I wanted it to work, and you put so much time and effort into things, and but I would say, like, with the medical writing piece, like, we would have a deliverable, you got it done, and you moved on with your life. And so it was, I felt like a lot of easy wins, but, also you may not get recognition, right? Particularly if you're working for an agency where it's the client who ultimately owns that deliverable, and they're the ones that are going to get the awards or things like that. And there were instances where, like, my clients actually won innovation awards for the work that I did. And so, but that's okay because that's my job, right? And so I was doing my job well. I would say it's actually a really stable career. There is a lot of job opportunity there. I know that they're always looking for medical writers, but I would say that it kind of depends on the sector. So, it again, there's kind of going back to that journalism, et cetera. I don't know like what the stability is there. I would say from an agency role, it's pretty good. You have a ton of different projects, and I hope I demonstrated that through. I was constantly working on something new, and I loved it because I don't want to get bored. However, you also have a lot of competing priorities because every client thinks that their thing is the most important. And so when you have multiple clients, you're dealing with kind of how to navigate that. You have really good cross-functional collaborations, as I mentioned. Like, we were working across the departments, and so I was working with studio. I was working with new business, as well as our client service groups. However, I was also working with a bunch of different clients within the pharmaceutical company, and they were all across the different departments within that company. The downside is you have meetings. I probably spend 90% of my day in meetings. Um, Upside, you get to work with experts. Like I mentioned, I got to work with some of the people who are like the leading expert in chronic myeloid leukemia or the leading expert in myelofibrosis. And they're pretty amazing people and actually really fun people. However, they also have extremely strong opinions. And so because you are doing what they're asking, you kind of have to concede, right? Like, you do what they tell you to do sometimes. And so if that's something that doesn't work for you, it's just to take note. And then I would say travel. So as I mentioned, I traveled extensively. I loved it, but I know there are people that that's not something that they want to do. And so I think, like, were you to talk and to go and ask somebody about medical writing, that is something that you could take into consideration because there are opportunities in medical writing that do not require as much travel as like what I did. Okay, so that kind of captures my life at Articulate Science. And then what happened was actually the reason why I decided to leave the company was I was not unhappy. I loved it. I absolutely adored my job, but my dad got prostate cancer. And so I was hoping to get closer to my family who lives in Lewiston, Idaho, and to be there for them. He's fine. Yeah. However, I was like, okay, I'm the black sheep of the family that lives out on the East Coast, and all of my family lives out on the West Coast. So I got called up actually by my best friend, who also was a PhD in the Pharm Tox program at WSU. And she's like, hey, there's a job opening here that really seems to fit, what you're looking for. Would you consider it? And I was like, no, I don't want to move out to Seattle. I'm like, thanks, but no. And she's like, no, just come and interview, like at least try. And I was like, fine. And so I ended up coming and interviewing, taking the job. I was actually in the middle of buying a house in New Jersey when I took the position, so I had to back out of a contract. But it's actually been probably one of the best things that I've done for myself. And so I've been at Seattle Genetics, and just to give you a snapshot of Seattle Genetics, for those of you that don't know, we're considered a mid-sized pharmaceutical company at this point. People like to call us a biotech as well. The delineation between that is, I feel like it's kind of slim. We have one marketed product. It's called Etcetras, or brentuximab vedotin is the generic name. It's an antibody drug conjugate that targets CD30, and so it's largely used in lymphomas. We have indications in Hodgkin as well as CTCL, and probably soon to be more NHL, kind of more broad. We do have ALCL as well. Additionally, we have about 12 different programs where they're mostly antibody drug conjugates against different targets. We also just recently acquired Cascadian Therapeutics, who has a small molecule called tucatinib. It's a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and so we are expanding kind of what our typical pipeline has looked like. And it's an exciting time to be there. I would say when I joined in 2014, there were approximately 500 employees, and now we're about 1,500. So we've rapidly expanded over the past few years. And it's a good company. Like, yeah. So just kind of a snapshot. And so my responsibility at Seattle Genetics has been to head up our medical communications department. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Additionally, I help to do the strategic publication planning, similar to kind of what I did in my previous life for these pipeline products. Oops, sorry about that. That was really loud. So I want to talk to you a little bit about medical affairs. So my department sits under the umbrella of medical affairs, and there's kind of a dual role. And I don't know how much you guys know about kind of the pharmaceutical industry and the setup of the different departments. We're just one of many departments, right? And so we act kind of as a bridge between the company and external stakeholders, that being pharmacists, MDs, the oncologists, the nurses, payers, going and talking to Aetna, Cigna, et cetera. And so even patients. Additionally, we bridge between research and development and commercialization. And so a lot of times, it kind of depends on the company. Sometimes medical affairs departments are formed when there's actually an approved product. But we also are able to talk about pipelines. So we're different than commercial in the sense that we can talk about things off-label. And so we can go and we can talk to physicians about what's coming up. If they have a question about, say, Etcetris, our marketed product, and they're like, hey, how does Etcetris work in dolphins? Our sales team can't talk about that, right? They need to go off of the prescribing information, whereas we can actually try to address that. There's no example of Etcetris in a dolphin, but anyway, just to give you an example. And then within medical affairs, and every company is structured differently, and so don't take this as, the end-all be-all of how it is. But we do have kind of a separation, more of focus on education. So as you can see, there's medical communication, medical education, medical information, our medical science liaisons. Additionally, we have kind of what we consider our creation aspect of medical affairs, which is our scientific alliances. So I'm going to mostly focus on education, so I'm going to briefly talk about the creation here on this slide. So scientific alliances is our investigator-sponsored studies. They're responsible for kind of getting the startup of anything that an external person would want to do. So we set the strategy of these are the things that we're interested in you studying our drug in. And so we'll say, dolphins, whales, et cetera. And then people write proposals. And then similarly, so, probably faculty here have these sort of studies going on. And so it could be a translational research agreement. It could just be like a material science, like transfer of material, up to running large clinical studies. And so that group is responsible for kind of like overseeing all of that process. Additionally, we have our medical directors, and they are responsible for kind of like overseeing the strategy of everything that's happening with medical affairs. These people tend to be Ph.D s, PharmDs, or MDs. Most likely what you'll see out there are MDs with some PharmDs. And so they have really broad experience across the board. So let me dive into a little bit more about the separate departments underneath that education. And so one of the things, and you may not be able to see this extremely well, that I wanted to kind of get across is that the results of a single study, just one single clinical trial, have numerous impact on all of the different things that are happening across the company, whether it's from, talking to advocacy groups, writing case reports, doing publications, right? They're super important. The medical education aspects, what the sales reps are going out and talking about. They're talking about those clinical studies. And so I've always felt like medical communications was the most important because we're the ones responsible for getting that out there. But anyway, I like to toot my own horn there. No, but I think it really is like important that you're getting, your results out into the public so that you can talk about them and that they can be pulled through all of these different areas within the company. So what exactly would we consider medical communications? And so it's really, trying to be strategic about thinking about how we're going to deliver information and data about the product and its value throughout its clinical life cycle development. My group ensures that, the data is not only timely but effectively disseminated to different target audiences. And so that again goes back to whether it's HCPs, more nursing focused, more patient focused, et cetera. And so we do that through kind of this iterative cycle. Well, we'll look at kind of like what data do we have? What's the current landscape? And so we will strategically think like, okay, this is product X. We want to talk about product X. What do we want to say from, what do we want people to know about, this product? And so we'll sit down and actually kind of brainstorm, what are those things? What are the talking points? So we define our communication priorities, and then we will write actual scientific statements. And these are evidence-based, so we're not just making things up, right? We will write aspirational ones that we hope to have data for later down the road. And then we talk about, okay, well, who's our target audience? So for example, I'm currently working on a drug, and that's going to be going hopefully into bladder cancer. And in the bladder cancer space is interesting in that you may be working with urologists, you may be working with medical oncologists. Obviously there's always the nurses who are involved. And so depending on that target audience, you may want to customize how you're talking about the product, right? And so we think about that. We identify where we want to take the data, develop the plan, implement it, and then track and monitor. Were we effective? We will look at metrics to kind of see like, what sort of impact factor did we get, in our data into. I don't know if people know about alt metrics here, but there is actually kind of a newer thing where this is looking at how well disseminated was that publication. So it takes into consideration not only the journal, but like how many tweets you had, how many, like kind of the biomedical journalism, how many of those people picked up your story, et cetera. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we're doing. I know it's not everything, but so that my group does that for all of our products that we have in the pipeline as well as our approved product. I currently have 6 people who sit underneath me who are all kind of working on different compounds. Additionally, within my group, we do Congress booth planning. So when you go to these larger scientific conferences, they have these big, beautiful booths. My group develops all the materials for this. So, what we're going to be talking about, what are the videos that we're doing, how we're communicating it to kind of those physicians who are coming to visit us. And this is different than the commercial side of the booth where that's just approved product. We're able to talk across our pipeline. So that's an example. Additionally, my group helps with a lot of different things. So like I said, MOA development. We also have sat as a medical reviewer on promotional materials, so those materials that are actually going to physicians that are branded. We do health economics and outcomes sort of work. Additionally, we help train our medical science liaisons. And I talked about the Congress booth planning. So that's kind of a snapshot of medical communications as a department. So then there's also medical information. And so I want to talk to you guys about this because I know that we do have some PharmDs, et cetera, in the room. And so I want to give you kind of a little idea of what other departments are doing within medical affairs because there's a lot of opportunity there. So medical information is really, their responsibility is scientific exchange. And generally, they could be the very first point of contact for a lot of people with our company. And so, they're generally staffed by PharmDs, nurses, MDs, Ph.Ds, similar, to even my group. Most often, I would say that they probably have their PharmD because, through your guys' training, for the PharmDs that are in the room, like you're trained to provide drug information. That's part of the mainstay, right? And so, and you've worked within kind of clinics or, the hospitals and those different practice settings. The main responsibility for medical information is responding to medical information inquiries that come in, whether they be through the mail, faxed in, which is super old school, but email, telephone, so they staff kind of what's called a contact center. So even as a patient, you can call a company up and ask them about the product. And, they have what are called standard response documents. That they're going to provide either a verbal response or they may ask if they can email you something so that you can dig in a little bit deeper. The MedInfo team is also responsible for more than that. So They help with submission of our data to treatment guidelines and compendia, so that, say it's not an approved indication quite yet. There are instances where we can get into guidelines, and yet payers, the insurance groups, will actually reimburse for that. So, it'd be the off-label use, but still being reimbursed. Additionally, they're responsible for pulling together our dossiers. And so these dossiers are really just kind of like this robust document that describes essentially everything about the product that is submitted to the different payer groups. And so if they have sort of any inquiries, they kind of guide them to the dossier. The additional thing about medical information that's kind of nice is because they tend to be that first point of contact, and because they really are kind of writing down all of the questions that are being asked in some way, like they're monitoring that. They're great at being able to provide kind of insight analytics to everybody else within the company of, hey, we're getting a lot of questions on peripheral neuropathy. Maybe we need to do something to educate more on peripheral neuropathy. So like they can come back to us and give us ideas of what additional publications we might need or patient materials, et cetera. So that's a snapshot of medical information. Independent medical education. And so this is called different things across the pharmaceutical industry. It may just be medical education. It may be continuing medical education. And so particularly for the PharmDs in the room, you're going to be required to have continuing medical education credits. And I think all of us want to continuously learn, right? And so this is a good thing. And so their responsibility really is educating healthcare professionals and patients on the latest development with our products. I put up an example of the Hodgkin lymphoma kind of guidelines from the NCCN, something that we worked on to actually sponsor. Additionally, we do live education as well as digital education. The unique aspects of this is within the pharmaceutical industry, particularly within the United States, this is fully independent. And so we also will put out a request for proposals. We'll ask different groups, WebMD, for example, is one that comes to us quite often. We'll say, we want to educate on the use of antibody drug conjugates in multiple myeloma. And so then they come with essentially what their scope would be and what that might look like. We assess it, and then we provide them money. And so then they go and they develop all the content independently. However, our name would be there from a sponsorship. And so there are people within medical education whose sole responsibility is to coordinate all of these different education things, as well as to be those who are setting the strategy and assessing what those proposals look like. For medical education, there are people who have higher degrees. It's not something that you need to have. There's also a certificate for medical education if anybody were interested in going into this role. And last, I'll talk about the medical science liaison. So this is our field staff. They're out there, they're the boots on the ground. They're talking to physicians. They're engaging with pharmacists or sometimes even pathologists, depending on the product and whether they need biomarker testing, et cetera. Generally, our medical science liaisons or MSLs will have an advanced scientific training. And so all of our MSLs, except for I think one, have either an MD, Ph.D., PharmD, or a nursing degree. We do have one who has MBA. But anyway, and they really, they concentrate on certain therapeutic areas. Our MSLs are tasked with actually knowing kind of every therapeutic area across the pipeline, but it depends on the company and how big the company is and how big the product is. So it may be just like you go out and you talk about, bladder cancer, or you do all of it. And they really are there to help. So similar, I talked about scientific alliances with the investigator-sponsored studies. So they're really there to help them as well, to make sure that they have everything they need, that those physicians are enrolling on their clinical studies well. They help with our own company-sponsored clinical studies, see, if there's anything that investigators need, are they enrolling patients, when are they going to publish their data, et cetera. Additionally, they're there to go out and talk about the new developments that are off-label, right? So they have the ability to proactively talk about things, but also in a reactive manner. And so they, are constantly engaging with our investigators. And they're really kind of considered that external expert for the company, to talk about our products and know what's happening. Yeah, and one of the big things about obviously working with a bunch of physicians across the world is you want to maintain good relationships, right? You want them to know what your company is up to, what's coming down the pipeline, what are the exciting things. And that's their primary role for the most part, I would say, is actually kind of maintaining that relationship and ensuring that all of these investigators and physicians have what they need to do their jobs well. So yeah, so that's kind of the snapshot of that education portion of medical affairs. The good and the bad of medical affairs, I would say, is quite similar to medical writing. I think that you can apply it across very well. And in thinking about this, like my job, I travel actually quite frequently, but a lot of the headquarters-based positions, such as medical education, medical communications, the medical directors, etc., like they may not travel as much. Whereas if you think like an MSL role would be something you'd be interested, you're going to travel pretty frequently, and that's just the way it is, because generally so for example, we have 18 MSLs within Seattle Genetics, and so we're covering all of the United States and Canada. And our poor Canadian MSL, there's one. But anyway, but yeah, so we have, you're covering like multiple territories. Additionally, so just kind of thinking about what are the things that you could be doing to break into medical writing or medical affairs. We talked about kind of expanding your critical thinking skills. I would encourage you to present your research as often as possible. And this doesn't necessarily mean just for medical affairs or whatever, but I really think this helps you to become perceived as a leader in your field, which is going to push your career even further. And so, you know your data the best, so definitely get out there and talk about it. If possible, I'd recommend doing like an internship or a fellowship at a biotech or pharma company. Quite honestly, I think that the program was really good about prepping us for moving into academia, and probably like less focused on the biotech or pharma careers. That's what I took, and so I learned so much just even by doing informational interviews with people that I met along the way. Additionally, so PharmDs, I would say there's a fair number of opportunities for internships within the pharmaceutical realm. And I think like you guys probably know, or you may learn about ours. Additionally, I will kind of put a plug in, is that I'm actually trying to develop a Ph.D. fellowship for medical affairs at Seattle Genetics, because I find that to be something that would be potentially useful. And like I said, do informational interviews. So even if you can't get your foot in, just talk to people. I think most people are absolutely willing to sit down and spend half an hour with you on the phone or whatever. Grow your professional network. So while you're at conferences, when you're presenting your data, talk to people. I know it sucks. I actually hate networking. It's the worst. But it sometimes really is about who you know and how you can get your foot in the door, because I think, doors open. I would recommend tailoring your CV or cover letter for the position. I think when I initially started, I was just kind of like, this template CV, regardless of job, whether I was applying for a research job or within the medical writing, and I started tailoring it and found that I got a much more of a bite. And then again, emphasize your strengths, achievements, and transferable skills. And so you guys have transferable skills. You're presenting, you're writing papers, you're out there talking, and so these are things that within the pharmaceutical world you need. I'm regularly running meetings, right? So like I need to be able to present. I need to be able to put together things that will effectively communicate what I need from other stakeholders within my company, but then also external to the company. So yeah, and then I think that's it. So any questions? Additionally, I threw up my email address there. If you want to talk to me or have additional questions, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to discuss stuff with you. So, thank you.